I'm so happy to have Ryan Chittum here. This is just going to be a really fun conversation for me because, like I was telling you a second ago, I'm just really into this press and media, and you have like a really impressive background to me. I was just looking up stuff this morning, and I'm like, man, you have some credentials that are really impressive as an investigative journalist and covering other stuff too. So thanks for coming. And
of course, glad to be here.
Yeah. So yeah, let's kind of start there. Like, tell me, did you get into journalism at a very young age? Like, how did you fall into it, and what was your path to Wall Street Journal and all that?
Fell backwards into it. I went to college at Oklahoma, University of Oklahoma. I'm from Tulsa.
Okay.
And had a scholarship and went to school for 4 years, studied history, and realized I was a terrible student, but also realized, what am I going to do with my life after I get a history degree? I didn't want to teach, and so I dropped out for a year or so and then came back. And I realized somewhere in there, hey, I like reading the news and watching the news a lot. And it was basically as simple as that. It's like, maybe I should do journalism. So I took an intro class and got on the school newspaper and kind of went from there. And basically, I went back to school for another couple of years and didn't go to much school and spent all my time working on the paper and delivering the paper so I could pay for school.
Okay.
And then kind of went from there. I came from a working class background, but my dad was always a newspaper reader. So the Tulsa World, we always had the Tulsa World. He subscribed, read it religiously. And so from a very early age, I was like a news junkie,
Okay.
And it was just in the house. So
Do you know, is that still around? I'm just curious.
the Tulsa World is still around.
I know a lot
barely.
of papers are, struggling.
Warren Buffett bought it, 10 years ago, and he's sold it on now to Lee Enterprises. It was kind of a sad thing. If there was any one person who could have saved the newspaper business, it was Warren Buffett, because he has the resources, the know-how, the business sense, and the love of newspapers that, even tactile print and everything that, your typical private equity or Wall Street people don't. But it turns out he bought all these newspapers and then just milked them dry like everybody else did. He didn't invest in them. So it could have been a turning point in newspapers, and he probably realized there's no salvaging this business like everybody else, and so he's just gonna milk it dry. But
So
if he laid out a couple billion, a small fraction of his fortune, he could have
That's true,
turned things around.
Yeah. I'm just always impressed. Like, I work up in Vancouver, and I'm at the Columbian's still doing it, I think. I think they do print. They're definitely online, but I don't know. All of them, I'm just like, well, I don't know how they
Not for long.
make that much money, but yeah, not for long, probably.
I mean, the Oregonian's been 4 days for about 10 years now. They just went to 4 days on the newsstands because they would deliver it
Okay.
4 days a week, but they still print it every day. But they'd only put it in newsstands because the cost
For distribution.
is so high. And, I expect that's not going to make it for too long. I don't know their finances, but, eventually you'll probably have the Sunday paper will be the last thing to go because it's still the most lucrative. But
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
there's not really a sense that will be around in 10 years even. So if people want it, they're going to have to pay in exorbitant prices. Like a New York Times subscription costs $1,000 a year now.
Is that right? I didn't know that. Wow.
They don't have ads hardly. So
Okay, right. It's all subscription.
the subscribers, they say, we'll still print it and deliver it to you, but we're going to charge you, say, 10% more than it costs to deliver it. And if enough people will do that, they can do it. So.
That's incredible, though. So they're paying over $100 or $100 a month, basically, for,
Unless you're discounted, but
Yeah. Wow. So tell me, so you went from the school paper. What was after that?
I did it. Norman, where OU is, had a 9/11 connection. The 20th hijacker, Zachariah Moussaoui, went to flight school there in a few months before 9/11. He got arrested in Minneapolis or Minnesota because he was taking flight lessons there and only wanted to learn how to fly the plane, not to take off or land. So that drew the attention of the instructors and then the feds. So after 9/11 happened, I was kind of the investigative project reporter at the paper, the college paper, and I was doing some stuff, and the dean called me in, and the New York Times needed a stringer. So I did a bunch of stuff from that for them. Tracking down leads. Like the first lead I had, they give me some like 2 names and an address, and like, can you go check this out? And this is like 3 days after 9/11, so everybody's still freaked out. You don't know when the next shoe is going to drop. And it was like, I'm looking at that right across my parking lot, and so I walked out, knocked on the door, and it was like European exchange students who'd clearly already been visited by the feds and were freaked out. But so I did a bunch of reporting on Moussaoui and his time in Norman, and wrote stories, and then I did some stories on what was then the INS, Immigration Naturalization Service, that was picking up Muslim students in Norman and holding them, incommunicado without lawyers. That drew the attention of the Journal. They offered me a internship. I never thought about the Wall Street Journal. It was not even a thing to me. And I was like, okay, well, better go. So I did that, went up there, did an internship, and then they offered me a reporting job, so I stayed there.
Nice.
So I was in New York like a year after 9/11.
Okay.
Working for the Wall Street Journal. So it was a big change.
Yeah, well, it's had to be such a turbulent time for media, right? Because going, and then Iraq after that, and
well, we thought it was a bad time for media because the tech bust had happened at that point. It was the .com bust, and the newspapers had been fat up through 99 and 2000, and then the tech bubble bust, and all those ads dried up, and like they put pay freezes on us. They weren't hiring. They were laying people off. Oh, what a terrible time to go into journalism. And that was like the last good time for journalism.
kind of the heyday, yeah.
Still 2002.
Well, and I also meant turbulent just in the sense of like there's just so much going on, and also I don't know. I was like in high school, but I just remember it just seemed so confusing of like, I don't know, and maybe for adults at the time it was a little more clear of like, okay, and then we're just going to war, and like everyone's trying to sort out, what's reality, and then I don't know. I can't remember when the 9/11 report, that was like later that came out. But
yeah, it was like 2005.
It just seems like so much was going on, but I mean, there's a lot to report on.
Obviously. Oh yeah. I mean, yeah, and that's one thing that I regret, like going to the Journal. I kind of took that brass ring a little bit because I was, hey, I'm a Rube from Oklahoma, and I'll go to New York, work for the Journal, and they put me on commercial real estate, and I was like, oh my god.
And that's right before
crap?
2008.
This was 2002 when I started on commercial real estate.
So I guess that was a great time at that point.
It could have been commercial real estate, but I was covering shopping malls and budget hotels,
retail centers.
Yeah, so I think like I would have done better like going to the Tulsa World or something and staying a news reporter. And so but I don't regret it. Like I met my wife in New York. And, I've made lots of friends, and got experiences that I never would have had otherwise. But I think just as purely as a reporting thing, I would have had more fun somewhere else.
Yeah.
Like my friends who worked on the Metro papers, like embedded in Iraq and got to go to cover the invasion and things like that. When I raised my hand to do that at the Journal, they're like, I was like, I'm cannon fodder. I'm not married or anything.
Right.
They wouldn't do it.
You were just gung-ho.
Yeah.
In there. I'm curious, like, do you think, because I don't know, you probably know better than me, is that pathway, like, with a school paper, even at the high school and college, does that still exist? Like, do they?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, not as much. And I've had some people ask me whether they should go into journalism. I'm like,
it's hard to answer.
I wouldn't recommend my kids do it unless somehow I strike it rich and can leave them a huge trust fund or something. I mean, basically, I think it's something like 60% of the jobs in newspapers are gone since 2008. So, some digital jobs have sprung up, but not nearly enough to make up for that.
Mm-hmm.
So newspapers were like the engine of American news gathering. The TV news was largely dependent on news. You know, they had their own newsrooms and reporters, but still, like, they used to be dependent on the newspapers to dig it up, and they would follow those stories.
Yeah.
And so, you know, there's nothing that can replace that. You still have, like, the Journal is still a great newspaper. Murdoch's mostly kept his hands off of it, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I honestly think, like, without him owning it now, I was very critical about, I was quoted in the New York Times while I was still a reporter at the Journal, like, this is bad, Murdoch. It's a dark day, I think I said. Murdoch closed the deal. But I think at knowing what we know now, had somebody else or the family that still owned it, the paper wouldn't exist in nearly its, you know, current form and its quality. And then the Times still has a lot of resources. Washington Post is owned by Bezos. So, you know, the elite papers are doing well. They made it through because they can charge for subscriptions. But you're like Oregonian, you know, they could have tried to charge people online 15 years ago and they didn't. And now they can't because they've had to cut their news staff so much that there's not anything to pay for anymore. So.
Yeah, I do feel like, those like state or city level ones, they don't have the brand, obviously, that these huge, you know, national papers have. And
no, and it's a shame. I mean, the question is, like, well, you've had 1,600 newspapers in the U.S. and, you know, other than the three major ones, even the L.A. Times, it used to be the one of the top 3 or 4 papers in the country, and it's not anymore.
Lagging.
But if it was possible for these some newspaper to make it through this technological seismic shift, then one would have done it, and really hasn't happened. I mean, you see some things like the Boston Globe and Star Tribune in Minneapolis. They've done as well as you can by trying to charge people online, and I think Boston Globe charges like $30 a month or something, so real money.
Wow.
So, but that's the only way you can make it go, because the ads are just never going to be there for
just for
the news.
That old ad revenue is just not. It's interesting because I always tell people, I was just saying this the other week, but for her TV, it's like they limp along just from like elections and then sports and like weather.
Right.
But even that's a struggle to. But
I'm surprised that TV still made it.
Yeah.
I always figured that they were the next to face the wrecking ball, and it may still come, you know?
Yeah, it probably, well, it's basically like you were saying earlier, I don't know if it was when we were recording or not, but the same thing's going on. Like, all of it just gets further conglomerated into these equity groups or these like investing groups, and it's just fewer and fewer hands, and that's been happening. Even when I was there, like I've seen probably 5 different changing of hands of owners, and everyone just the pay gets less, and it's the same squeeze that you were talking about with paper.
You got to do more with less.
Yeah.
Favorite phrase of the news industry, bean counters.
Yeah.
So, and you can't, you know, it's like at a certain point you can't get any more blood out of that turnip. So
yeah. Well, I'm curious about the Pulitzer you were like winning. Did you technically won that with like a group?
Yeah, I have a share of it.
So you have
a little share.
You have like a quarter of a trophy or whatever.
Not a quarter of a yeah, more like a, you know, 20th or 1/300th, depending on how you want to look at it.
It's really cool.
Yeah,
that was the Panama Papers one?
Panama Papers.
That's just incredible because I remember that, and I was just like in the past few days looking at it, I didn't even know you were a part of that, and so you guys kind of opened that story up. And
yeah, I was at the Columbia Journalism Review. After the Journal, I was a business media critic for several years, and they had some like leadership changes there, and my boss left, and it just wasn't the same place. So I was looking to get out, and ICIJ, which is the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, came to me and asked me if I would come do a project with them for 3 months. I was like, oh, I got my 3rd baby is on the way here in a month, and I don't think I can like give up my job to take a 3-month contract. And so they went and got somebody else, and then we had the baby, and I came back to work, and I was like, oh, this sucks. So I asked them if they had another thing, and they gave me one. So I went in on that project, and that was the Swiss leaks, which we had a bunch of documents from HSBC, the big Swiss private bank.
Yeah.
And that was fun, and I loved that stuff. And then they kept me on for a while, and they kept saying, here's a little stuff to do, and we've got another big thing coming. And then eventually it comes out that these German reporters at Süddeutsche Zeitung had a massive document leak from Panamanian law firm Mossack Fonseca. And so we kind of got it dribbled out. Like, they had this mass of data. I think it was 2.4 terabytes, I think, something like that.
Yeah.
And but they had to process the data. They had to OCR so we could search it. They had to make it something that we could use. And so there was a bunch of, technical time spent doing that. So at first we got these little dribs and drabs. Like, I don't remember what the first one we got to look at was, 100 gigs or something, like a small fraction of it.
And are they just like, it's literally just like a folder of files kind of thing?
I don't know how they got what structure.
Or it's like
the
raw
tech guys got
data,
it.
and then they kind of sort it out or something.
Yeah. And then they would have to put it in these databases and allow us to search it. And then we'd be able to put people in and see their connections to other people and corporations. And now you can go online and look at ICIJ's site and see the kind of what we were doing there.
It's all in a database. And
Not the documents, because that could open up some like libel issues, I think, in case there were any fraudulent documents in there. But the like company connections, the shell company owners, and
Gotcha.
so yeah, we would get these dribs and drabs, and then when you start, it was like digging into a gold mine or something as a reporter. You're like, oh, you search this term, fraud, like obvious things, and then you get more esoteric, and it became a skill to kind of look through this haystack, but it had a lot of needles. So you could find stuff, and it was in Spanish. A lot of it was Spanish.
Okay.
And then you had to figure out, like, what's a beneficial owner? What's very basic things, that, and eventually, so we had like 12 of us, I think, at ICIJ, and then we partnered. The model was like, you boost by partnering with all these newsrooms in various countries. I think we eventually had like 300 people working on it in 70.
Because there's so much to go through.
Yeah. 70 something countries. So they would know the lay of the land in their own country. So I worked with a guy in Iceland. He's one of their famous TV journalists. And, Iceland's like 350,000 people. So it's like half the size of Portland. So if you're a TV journalist, you're famous in Iceland.
Star, yeah.
But he's a really good journalist. And so he, we worked on the story. The prime minister there he had a shell company that he didn't disclose called Wintris. And that, we report when we published Panama Papers, he like caused this huge uproar in Iceland, and they're like pelting the parliament and stuff. And he resigned a few days later. So
Jeez.
That was a big story. But yeah, I mean, it was like you got all these bad guys in there, and kings and presidents and politicians, and it was just like, the thing about it is, like, I knew as I was working, I'll never work on a story as good as this again.
Yeah. I was just thinking, like, is that because it's just, there's stories like of that scale, and they only come along once in a while. I was also thinking, was it reminiscent of like what you know about like when the Twitter files came out, that sort of thing of like the same sorting and.
I wonder, I don't exactly know how they did the Twitter files. I mean, Elon Musk opened the whole thing up to him.
Yeah.
I think. I don't know if they got everything they wanted, With us, it was like, we didn't, I think the Twitter files, they had to go through an intermediary to get the documents, if I remember correct. I could be wrong, but with us, it was just like, here's this stuff, you go get it. So there was no PR or no whatever. So
a little more nebulous.
a little more nebulous. But the Twitter files, you know, it was funny seeing them look at it because you could see them trying to get their heads around this massive amount of data. And what are they doing? And it's like, it's so, even if you're looking at one document in isolation, it could take you 6 months to really understand the context of that, and that there's a bigger story, or that there's no story, you know? And so, unfortunately, like Musk is so mercurial, you know, he cut Taibbi off and stuff. And so I don't know if there's more in there, but I mean, that was also a story which was a huge story that the mainstream press didn't want to cover.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So that's also disappointing. But
I was also curious about, unless you want to add more to the Panama thing, but I was also curious about, because you wrote also on Silk Road. Is that right?
No,
okay.
Not Silk Road.
Okay.
No. We published a book with...
That's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah,
okay.
we published a book. It was like the best business writing. And so we
There's
just
a bunch
like
of stories and
gave that. Yeah, we picked that one as
that's cool.
as one that we printed for that year. So
okay, that's what
I wish I had done Silk Road.
No, that's
although my wife probably doesn't want it.
no, it came
dangerous
up
story
recently in my life, and I was just thinking about it. I'm like, man, I remember that and how big of a thing that was. But yeah, were you always into? Was it always investigative from the start? Like you just wanted to go after that?
I mean, I did that even as a college. You know, I started off doing like chili cook-offs at the college campus and the crap stories and stuff. But pretty quickly, I knew what news was and knew how to go get it, and so I did that. Pretty like within a year, I was doing that kind of stuff. When I got to the Wall Street Journal, I was like a young reporter, and I was not on. I mean, looking back now, knowing what I know now, I probably could have done investigations, better stuff, but it didn't lend itself to like investigative stuff, which I didn't like at all. And so, you know, at CJR I was a media critic, and so it kind of had that mentality. You know, my boss there was an investigative reporter, so he had that mentality too. So we were always looking at it from the investigative mentality. But ultimately, like my reason for getting in journalism was, you know, the reason for being interested in journalism was I just wanted like to know what's happening in the world, like what's real, what's true,
Just awareness.
who's BSing me, why are things this way. Like the investigative stuff is a piece of that. It's not like, I think where it goes awry a lot is it becomes like an activism thing.
Right.
And what you used to have more, I think, was like editors that would, the investigative reporters were typically cranks, you know, like, or malcontents, you know, disproportionately, not everyone. But so you had editors and strong institutions that would keep them in check. Right.
Kind of keep them at bay and when they needed to.
So like Seymour Hersh, you know, did my lay at the New York Times or New Yorker, I can't remember. I think it was New York Times. And he did Abu Ghraib at the New Yorker, and now he does like crazy stuff that he's on his own.
Really?
And it's kind of gone off the deep end, you know, but
that's the kind of person you need.
Yeah, because you got to be able to harness that mentality for truth, right? And so, and that's a tough line to navigate, but I think as the institutions have been weakened, you know, they don't have that as much anymore, and you don't have the resources to deploy investigative reporters as much anymore either. So
because a lot of this stuff takes a long time. Like you, I was watching Spotlight the other day. I love that movie, but I think there's something in there about they're like, you're gonna have to pay us for like 12 months just to like study stuff, you know. And a lot of people don't want to pay for that nowadays, I'd imagine.
I mean, I worked on Panama Papers for 2 years, and I maybe wrote like 5 or 6 stories total.
Wow.
And worked on it for a year, basically, before, it was probably 9 months, I think, before we ever printed anything. So it's like, you know, that's a massive, you had 300 something people working on it in 70 something countries without printing anything. So they all had to get their editors on board. And I believe that we went to the New York Times with the Panama Papers and they turned us down.
Wow.
They later went in with ICIJ on one of the projects, but They're like, nah, we do our own thing. So
Interesting.
yeah.
And so that's so funny because I've always like, when I was in TV here in Portland, I always, eventually I did like get to work with investigative reporters a lot. Like Dan Tilkin he's a great guy, and I got to shoot a lot of video with him. But I was always just drawn to the investigative dudes, and like all the other reporters. I'm just like, why aren't you like asking questions? And like, but is it seen like in your time too? Is it like the top of the food chain as far as if you really want to report?
Yeah, for sure.
That's kind of where you go.
I mean, also top of the food chain is like being a columnist, because then you really
can do whatever.
Yeah, you can report and then write your opinion too. So, although the line between those things has blurred in the last 10 years, but yeah, I mean, it's different in TV. I think, I mean, I'm gonna go back to when I was in college. I think like I had a professor who was really trying to push me into doing TV. He wanted the like 9/11 story. I was really resistant. I just kind of looked down on TV and stuff, and thought, you have to do superficial things. I get like a minute package. Like, what am I going to do?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
I have, I've got like 50 words or something. Why would I do that? But obviously, TV has a big role. But I think it also attracts like. I mean, print like attracts the like maladjusted, the uglies, the people who are like not at the top of the food chain in high school and stuff like that.
Right.
They're like nerds, and TV tends to attract the like you're on TV.
The opposite, yeah.
Like I got a face made for radio and a voice made for print. So
right. Well, yeah, there's a whole like vanity aspect to it,
but I mean. That was my own reverse snob thing back then, because certainly you can do like extremely important TV stuff. And, of course now newspapers are doing video and stuff too, but it's like, I think in the last several years, particularly in Portland, like the TV news that the Oregonian and the print papers weren't doing, TV covered that more.
You think so?
If it bleeds, it leads. I don't think they did a great job of it pre like 2021, but they did better than the Oregonian did. The Oregonian's trying to catch up now, but I think there was a lot of news that wouldn't have gone reported at all had it not been for the TV folks. So I have a newfound appreciation for TV, more so than I used to.
I could see that. Let me ask you about. This might seem like a weird question. I was telling you before, but I've been thinking about this for like at least a year. I think it's really important for younger people today to have a better understanding of the media landscape, and I wish we had media literacy classes, but I just don't know how. If that's even possible. Maybe that's a bad idea. I don't know, but
yeah,
I just feel like there is no beyond like those memes you've seen of like the news sources and like. The bias scale, like I don't think there's much education aside from like stuff like that about I don't know, I feel like everyone just kind of chooses their source and then they stick with it, and like they don't look outside of that. And
yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I don't even know how you would go about teaching it. I mean, my own kids, what I do is I'll say, hear a story, see a story, read a story, and say like, oh, well, here's what's being left out, and here's why. Because I've been around the block enough to know how the business works, and I've had enough back channel people who I know from major papers or whatever who will tell me what's going on, and so, but most people don't have that, I think like as far as media literacy classes. I'm just almost hesitant anymore to trust the institutions to even do something like that.
Right.
Like there's been a sort of war on objectivity, not just in the press, but in academia and
any kind of institution.
Yeah. Like we don't think objective truth exists or is attainable, so we're just not going to have that in the ethos anymore. And it's like, all right. But it tends to go one way.
Yeah.
So, I think like would the education boards be able to put something together? And it's not just like Oregon, of course, it would be biased to the left, but if you're in Florida or Tennessee or Oklahoma,
It's just gonna go the other way.
be the other way. But you could see a political solution where, oh, we've got half over here and half over here, and we come together and say this is what we agree on.
Yeah.
And maybe you kind of back into an objective media literacy program that way. But boy, I just don't think anything's working right now well enough to do it.
Yeah.
And probably it's a technological thing, like objectivity was a blip. You had monopoly newspapers in markets. They were the dominant news engines. They had to appeal to as wide a spectrum of readers and advertisers as possible. So we went down the middle. We had neutral language. We tried to get both sides. And the wreckage that the internet has done to the news industry, it kind of incentivizes returning more to a partisan press model, which was what the press was forever before that. You're playing to one side. The New York Times became the resistance paper in 2015, 2016, 2017.
Right.
And they boomed. Had they kept going straight down the line, they wouldn't have done that.
So the partisanship's actually helping in those bigger cases.
Yeah. But and it's the same thing. Like if you're trying to get clicks, you're trying to sensationalize stuff. Whereas in a newspaper, you were tamping down the sensationalism, unless you're like a tabloid, like New York Post.
Yeah,
or something.
yeah. That's a good way to put it.
But sometimes I think and I say this, like Portland needs its own tabloid because the press is too. I don't know if we want to touch that story.
Right.
Whereas, I always look down at tabloids and the New York Post and stuff. It was fun to read, but you're like, oh God, journalistically.
Right.
But there's a instinct there for news that overrides respectable sensibilities that can be necessary sometimes. And I think we've seen that in Portland and other places in the last few years. So I kind of half joke about Portland needing a tabloid.
Yeah, I could see that. Yeah. I was thinking too, but I wonder if because I moved here in 2006, but I wonder if at one point that's kind of what the Mercury was doing. I don't think when I was here it never was, but
man, the Mercury.
Yeah, I wouldn't even bring them up normally on the show, but
it's
that's more of an alt paper than a tabloid.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so's the Willamette Week, and Willamette Week is pound for pound maybe the best news organization in the country.
They've been doing great work.
I think they went off the rails too in 2019, 2020, 2021. But they sobered up pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And they do reporting that is, they've done some great reporting, particularly like Sophie Peel.
Sophie Peel, yeah. Because he kind of opened up the whole Shemia Fagan thing, I think.
Yeah.
And all that.
Like that story, that's a career story right there.
Mm-hmm.
She's not going to be in Portland long. Like she'll be at the Washington Post or New York Times or something. And but Nigel Jaquist has been.
He's been there forever, yeah.
Forever. And he's as good as a reporter as you get. So, we're lucky to have them.
Yeah. I was thinking, do you think that's, because in my mind, I just default to that was out of necessity or survival that they kind of pivoted to that. Or maybe it's just a natural kind of thing of nobody else here is talking about this or they just stumbled upon, I don't know.
I think at a certain point, I've wondered, because there's a noticeable turn, because I was pulling my hair out and screaming and about the press coverage here in 2020 and 2021. And it shifted, I think, kind of late 2021 or early 2022. Became oh yeah, there's some real bad stuff going on here. The bodies are stacking up.
Yeah, they're having shootings every day and riots
and all that stuff. I can't walk down the sidewalk anymore without my kid can't walk to school without an escort or something. The city visibly deteriorated, and it was already not in great shape in 2018, 2019. But I think, my cynical take on it is that these editors and reporters got a little too close to their neighborhoods, and so you can tell like who who lives in Park Rose or something,
Yeah.
versus like who's in Southwest or
Yeah.
West Hills or something.
That kind of reminds me. Do you remember that one? This was maybe like a year or two ago, but there was a guy who got, I don't even know who he was, but he got roasted because he was like writing from a condo in like the South Waterfront or something, and he's like, Portland's beautiful. I don't know what everyone's talking about, and but he got kind of lit up because they're like, yeah, if you go down the elevator and like walk outside, you'll kind of see.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I do agree that like, I don't know. I'm thankful for a lot of the reporting Lampwick's been doing. I'm thankful there's somebody doing it, here locally.
Well, and the Oregonians picked up too.
Yeah,
They've done.
I do want to shout out Shane. I've known him for a while, and he does
Kavanaugh's
good
done
work. Yeah.
a lot of good work. Yeah, so I hope it continues,
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
And I hope that they make it through. I mean, there's got to be a recession coming, so that's when I think the like next shoe's going to drop with journalism. It's like, how are they going to make it through this? Like, this is the good times,
Right.
How are they going to make it through a negative 3-4% GDP,
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, and that's a real question.
yeah.
The election next year will be interesting. Maybe that'll give them, some mileage. But
Yeah.
we talked a little bit about this, but how do you feel about like citizen journalism today, online journalism? Do you see that as a helpful thing, or is that kind of not helpful for like young reporters? Or
Yeah, it's good. Like more journalism is good, I think. I used to be confident in that. No, I mean, when I was in the Guild, when I was like at the Journal and all this stuff was changing at CJR, I was very skeptical about citizen journalism, and I think appropriately so.
It's funny because I was too back when I was working in news. I would just kind of look at people like that and be like, yeah, well, why don't you come work for us, or why don't you?
I think a lot of what changed it was, frankly, what would we have not known about what happened in Portland in 2020 without the citizen journalists? I mean, to a certain extent, what did get reported by the mainstream press was because they're like, oh God, like, you can't deny or ignore what's happening here.
Yeah.
And it's like citizen journalists who weren't necessarily credible or didn't have the highest journalistic standards. But the video is the video,
Mm-hmm.
like to a certain extent. I mean, we all know like you have to see context and
Right.
what's in the camera is not back here.
Right.
But like they were a critical component here in 2020, I think around the country. And I just thought like in a disgraceful performance by the mainstream press. So that changed my tune a lot too, because like, oh yeah, you're seeing they have an important role to play here when the press has a blind spot or doesn't want to cover something,
Mm-hmm.
or doesn't want to appropriately cover something. So I think like, that's part of the media literacy stuff. It's like the standards, you don't know who you're dealing with,
Mm-hmm.
with a citizen journalist, or you get like a Tim Pool or something who goes off the deep end, and so it makes it much harder than it used to be when you had the Portland Oregonian. It was one of the 5 or 10 best papers in the country, and what they said was kind of like not the word of God, but it went through layers of editorial. This stuff, it's much easier to get stuff out there. It's much easier to get bad stuff out, but you can get good stuff too that wouldn't have seen the light of day.
Yeah.
So
That makes sense. Yeah.
but yeah, I don't know how you teach people to deal with that who've never been journalists and never had to check facts and
Yeah.
interview people and make sure that they're not missing something. Yeah, I mean, I think the argument against it gets weaker and weaker as the press retreats from its objective, institutional, sense-making task.
Right.
So if they continue on that path, and I think largely it's kind of turned back the other direction in the last year or two. But then, yeah, you're going to have citizen journalism and alternative journalism and stuff like that. And you always will, but it'd be more important than ever
Yeah,
if the
that makes sense.
heavies aren't covering stuff.
Yeah, yeah. So you're saying like the more that those heavy publications kind of, because it seems like now like most of the stories from a lot of mainstream is just has a certain agenda already. And you're saying as it continues more in that direction, it'll help citizen journalism. It'll make it more appealing.
And I think it's like the type of people who are doing it, right? Like, you know, at the Journal, like, and the Times, you know, half or more of the people there from the Ivy League went to the Ivy League.
Totally, yeah.
And that doesn't necessarily mean they came from elite backgrounds, but
it just,
usually upper middle class.
It reinforces that elitist kind of.
And these citizen journalists, I think, tend to come from more diverse backgrounds. So, you know, it's you're getting perspectives out there that aren't, you know, subject to the groupthink of the elite, you know, top 15 to 2% of the country.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big part of the media's problem.
I was curious, just now I thought of this when we were talking about it. Did you follow the whole Dave Portnoy Washington Post thing from like a week ago? Because I just thought, it made me think of that, and like, is that, I feel like that kind of, it's not exactly, I guess, what we're talking about, but I feel like that kind of old, mainstream, not really mainstream, it's like a institutional tactic of kind of pre-writing your story, I guess.
Yeah.
I just feel like all that kind of stuff is just so visible and easier for the public to see now, that will kind of also help what you were just describing. Like,
well, the sources can go direct now. That was a big change. Like when I was coming up in journalism, and the internet happened, and then you had social media happen, and blogs first, and then the blogs were like cause a big stir. Oh, these people can criticize us now and write that this is what we asked them in an interview on. That's not playing ball. That's not playing fair ball. And then social media just like hypercharged that. So like Portnoy, he owns his own megaphone now, and so does everybody to a certain extent. Like Joe Blow on the street, you know, he's got 200 followers, but if he gets picked up enough, or if it's the right thing, like he can, you know, cause a scandal at the New York Times. So it's a different, you know, that causes lots of power shifts and stuff. And you like the Washington Post, like, I don't know, like, you know, a lot of reporters go in there with a pre idea of a story. I mean, that's kind of what a story is. Like when you pitch a story,
right,
you know,
right.
You're like going, oh, well, here's my idea of what it is. But you're supposed to go in there with an open mind and talk to all sides and adjust as new information comes to light. What it seemed that the Post was doing there was going in there and trying to get a cancel campaign going.
Yeah.
They don't like the guy. Porter didn't like the guy. That's fine. But like, you know, is she doing that, you know, for somebody on her side of the political spectrum? No, almost certainly. So, and you see that enough that it justifiably causes people to question the agenda and thus the overall credibility of the press. You don't get a whole lot of those mulligans as an institution, you know, like, and especially now with all your people, your reporters on Twitter and on Facebook, and I think it was probably more so several years back, but it just exposed everybody's worldview.
Yes, yeah, that's true.
Well, can we really do this if we have 95% of our workforce that thinks
one way
this way and half the country thinks the other? So, I think, I mean, there's a whole tangle of issues there, but I think people, the reading public, it's healthy to have skepticism of the press. It can curdle, you know, into something that's like, you just don't believe anything that they say.
Right.
But the press has a big role in making that happen too. It's not like they're, helpless and innocent actors in the whole thing.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, and the Washington Post is an interesting one because like All the President's Men is still one of my favorite movies, but obviously just that whole story, it's like it's just such a weird shift for me to go from, because that in my mind is the epitome of like neutral, just we're just gonna find out what's going on, and I guess in some people's minds maybe that they're doing the same thing today, but I just see a totally different methodology and everything. I don't know.
And I mean, part of the problem the old heads would say is that everybody went into journalism after watching All the President's Men. Yeah. And it was like these sort of the type that I was talking about at the Journal and the Times. They're like, it became an elite profession rather than a working class, kind of skeptical, more cynical, in tune with the people on the street profession. I think there's something to that, but there's also like bigger shifts that have happened that have added to that. But yeah, I mean, it's always changing, and change isn't necessarily good.
Yeah.
Or if it's 51% good, it can be 49% bad. So
yeah. We get into. We talk about some local stuff. I'm just curious. Like, is there like we talked about the Shemia Fagan thing? Are there stories, like, obviously that's a huge one, but are there stuff that's like going on this year or like recently that you feel like needs to be reported on more?
I think,
or I'm just curious, like, what you're interested in at the moment.
What I'm interested in, and I say this as a former like NGO employee for, I worked for nonprofits for probably 10 years or whatever. But the nonprofit industry here to me is like, it needs investigating. And I think writ large nationally, there's something about it. And I don't know how to get my head around it, but like when you have government outsourcing its functions to non-profit entities, and
which you see that a lot in the city of Portland.
The city of Portland's terrible at San Francisco, but I think a lot of cities are. I don't exactly know, but like there's this like caste or something almost that's risen up that staffs these, and they think alike, and they, I don't know. It's insulated. I'm like a small D Democrat, like a populist. Some would say a slur, but like I think like you have to be accountable to the people at a certain point. And I'm skeptical, and I think that a lot of the outsourcing of that stuff is to avoid democratic accountability and or cronyism, or, I don't know. But it's like they have this, the Clean Energy Fund, that's handing out hundreds of millions of dollars via a nonprofit. Why is the state doing that?
Yeah.
If you want to pass a law to hand out money for climate change, why can't the state of Oregon do that? Like our elected officials and their employees do that. Why are you giving this pile of money to these other? So it just, and then the homeless stuff too. It's like so much of that money is being filtered through these nonprofits, and it's impossible even for a fully staffed. Like the Oregonian used to have 250 people. I think it's got like 70 now or something.
Yeah.
Even then, they would have had trouble covering it. But it's just impossible with the staffing in journalism now. And I don't think you have the like oversight and audit capabilities in the government to really. It's a one-party state, right? The incentive's not there for them unless they want to like unseat somebody or intra-party tension. So
that is an interesting thing though. Like I see, because someone could probably make a story about a series of these nonprofits. Cause there's, I think what you said, like the homelessness thing really highlights, because I know, I don't know if it was a homeless related one, but there was that one that Mingus Maps like grilled somebody on because they hadn't spent money in 2 years, and he's like,
right.
But I feel like, the homeless nonprofits get in there, and you just see this pattern of handing out a lot of money. It's hard to track, harder than, like you were saying, maybe if we just went straight from the government, and it just becomes this really cloudy kind of.
Well, and are they incentivized to actually fix the problem?
Right. Yes. And
I don't know. It's like you become captured by the problem. If I have a nonprofit and my salary comes from here, and I get to go to nice dinners and stuff like that, and hobnob with rich people, and whatever. And I don't know. I'm sorry to be nebulous. I haven't reported on that or anything. But
no, it's okay. Yeah.
it just strikes me, particularly here, that there's this sector that deserves much more scrutiny than it gets, and maybe part of the problem. You had Kevin Dahlgren on, right?
Yep. Yeah.
He talks about the homeless industrial complex. I was like, well, what does that mean exactly? Is it a thing? Is that just his, because he's run up against the bureaucracies and the frustrations of it. But is there something there? I mean, it seems like a story to me. You have to have a systemic look at it, though, and that takes a lot of resources. So,
yeah, it's that I don't know. That whole thing could be a interesting story.
Yeah.
So with the nonprofit stuff, like, do you think? And I know this is like speculative, but do you think that purely comes from the city just wanting to say, "Oh, this looks better to help these nonprofits by giving them some money. It's optically better," but then we have this issue of like results not kind of panning out, and like we don't know where the money goes exactly. And
yeah, I mean, it's a hard problem.
Is that why we
right?
see the pattern, do you think?
I think it's a hard problem. Like it may be an impossible problem. The homelessness thing, like I carp and complain about it, like a lot of people do here, but like I wouldn't want to be mayor.
Yeah.
Like
it's a thankless job.
Yeah. What are you gonna do? So I think it just seems, part of that is like, well, this nonprofit's got a pitch, and we'll fund them, and maybe they can do it. And if they can't, then it's the nonprofit's fault. And it just adds a layer of plausible deniability between you and the people.
Kind of a buffer.
Yeah. And the government also doesn't have the resources. So that's a question too. It's like, what happened to state capacity? Like, would FDR have outsourced the New Deal to nonprofit?
Yeah.
No, the Civilian Conservation Corps, he put people to work directly. Like, just seems like there's a failure to imagine like what, and it's odd for such a progressive city to imagine like what you could do with the government if you like, oh, well, we're going to hire somebody who's a czar, and he's going to hire these people, and they're going to go out and attack the problem.
That's interesting, because I worked on a story. This is like 2017 probably, with Jeff Gianola at Coin6, and he asked that question, and I thought it was really smart at the time of like, why does Portland not have a homelessness czar who like, because it's become such a problem in at the city level, to where I guess you could say now people, that's what they try to do with the Joint Office of Homelessness, which I know is under a lot of scrutiny as well, but
I mean, the whole place is just a nest of dysfunction. Like there's stories everywhere. Good God. And it's like, who's going to be mayor next? Mingus Maps, probably. God bless him. It's a tough job. I used to think, like, when we moved here in 2015 from Seattle, and I looking around the place, and I was like, man, I'm gonna laugh and laugh when they go to their Giuliani phase and like Law and Order.
Oh, right, yeah.
And sure enough, like the backlash has begun in Portland. It's not going to be like Rudolph Giuliani or whatever, but it's I think the voters are done with the nonsense, at least for a while, potentially. Maybe I'm being optimistic.
No, it does. I think it's kind of like you were saying earlier. At least that's what happened with me. I feel like is like a lot of people start what they're reading and then what they see outside are like two very different things. And at some point you have to believe what you're seeing through your own experience and stuff. And
well, I think, I mean, and understand that there's consequences of certain actions, and even well-intentioned thing. You know, everything has unintended consequences, and some have obvious consequences, like defunding your police department and getting rid of the like team that focuses on the 100 or so 200 most violent people and potentially violent people in the city, and then homicide triples in 3 years after. You know, it's like, oh, who could have foreseen that?
Right.
So I think people are making that connection better. It's not all like pie in the sky, and you know. So, but yeah, I mean, there's a mess of problems here. It's going to take a generation to dig out.
Yeah. What was that like coming here from Seattle at that point? Were they pretty much the same, like the state of the city? And because I always just
Portland was noticeably laxer on stuff,
okay,
I think, than Seattle.
Gotcha.
Even then, and Seattle's richer, right? Like there's
more money.
So and it's bigger, so it's a different thing. But I mean, I just noticed, like, it wasn't long after I was here, I think Charlie Hales passed that you could camp on public property overnight or whatever. It's like, really? That was like a 6-month trial thing, but that was an early sign to me that, like, oh, this is just like utopian kind of like nonsense. But yeah, I mean, Seattle's got its own problems too. Every city's got its own problems on the West Coast, particularly.
They just seem like they're all. I always just assume they're all the same. Like
the I-5 problem. Yeah.
I-5. Yeah, that's a good way. Yeah, the I-5. Yeah.
Vancouver, even different country, same problem.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So some of it, a lot of it is down to governance, but some of it's down to, you know, issues that, like fentanyl. It's like fentanyl wasn't really a thing 6-7 years ago even, and so the timing on that was real bad when you legalize, you know,
right,
110.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. And what do you feel
that was not covered appropriately? It was covered terribly, you know, by the press,
as far as before it was voted on and all that, and what it
and even still, like, I see, like, there's a group of people, I think, if it came up to a vote right now today, like, it'd go down 60-40 again.
Yeah.
But you know, there's a group of funders, like rich people, who are trying to do an anti-110 campaign or whatever, or they want to reform it. So OPB does a story and says, oh, these well-heeled interests, you know. OPB's terrible.
Yeah. I try not to talk about them on here, but they're not that great.
Not my favorite at all. And that's bad because they have a huge newsroom, relatively speaking. But well-heeled interests are, you know, going after 110 and all this. And it's like, okay, but when it passed, it got the pro side outspin it, the anti side 35-0 or 35-1. You know, did you cover that?
Yeah, it was totally absent coverage of that.
No,
and
so exact, like, now that all of a sudden the funding angle comes up, and I guarantee you it'll still be outspent if they try to reform it in 2024. The pro side will still
defend it.
Yeah, they'll still outspend it, but you know, it's just that kind of thing. It's just nonsense.
Yeah, I'm curious. Like, do you have a prediction as far as, do you think it'll go one way or the other? I ask, like, almost everyone that comes on here, like, what they think will happen with it. Full repeal, or I know there's like this modification bills, I think, that came up. And
yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think, yeah, it seems like they'll modify it before they do anything. I just don't imagine there's going to be a severe enough backlash to, unless the Democrats really get some bad polls or something.
Yeah.
But no, I don't think they're going to repeal the whole thing. So yeah, but they've got to have carve outs for fentanyl and like hard drugs and stuff.
Right.
I think that's where the people are, and so that's where the politicians probably go. But you know, I mean, yeah, and you see what happens after that. I don't expect it to make a huge dent and stuff. Like, the fentanyl issue is like a bigger issue that is beyond
yeah
local governance, you know. So that's gonna
it seems like it's also like permeated so much and the access to it so easy that like, yeah, those modifications might make a small dent, but not like they're not gonna.
Well, and Portland's had drug problems forever, right?
Time, yeah.
You know, and so my house, which we bought in 2015, I'm still finding needles in the walls and stuff. And
Really?
Yeah. So like that was the meth phase from a couple owners back, and yeah. So, but this stuff's like a different beast than that even. So,
yeah, it's a real challenge for sure.
Yeah.
We kind of talked about it, or you kind of mentioned this, but I'm curious, like your path to, I guess, Seattle, because you're saying from Tulsa originally.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what brought you originally to the Northwest? Was it just job stuff or school?
Well, I was in New York at the Wall Street Journal, and my future wife came to visit. She was on vacation. She had just graduated from school and was being a barista in Seattle, real cliche.
Okay, yeah.
And so she came and went to a concert. My former roommate was in a band in the Lower East Side, so I went out, and she came with a friend of them. So I met her. She eventually came to grad school in New York, and so we got married in 2008. Moved to DC for a year and a half. Got pregnant with twins. Had a 400 square foot apartment.
With twins?
Yeah. Well, they were still in utero.
It was on the way.
Yeah. And so we looked around and said, we got to go to out west. And so we moved in with her folks.
Okay.
For like a year, and then moved a few blocks from them in Seattle. We never would have made it without them. So my wife's from Seattle. And she was in like energy efficiency and energy policy and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So there are job prospects out here. And so we did that. And then, but a lot of her best friends were in Portland. So,
yeah.
And better job prospects down here. And I've been working remotely since 2007. So
really, I guess
I could go anywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, so we came down here, and with a year in Denmark in between. But
that's cool.
Yeah, so I love the Northwest. I mean, it's the most beautiful part of the country, but it's got some real problems.
Yeah, and you think it is? Because I was thinking I've never been to Tulsa. I've heard good things about it, but
love Tulsa. Not the most beautiful part of the country.
Okay. Yeah,
I hate to say it, but yeah, I mean,
it just doesn't have what like the West has.
Yeah, and having been on the East Coast for a long time, like when we moved out here, it was just like, oh, you can relax and breathe, and it's not that like New York kind of, there's tension in the air all the time, which can be good, but I just like the pace and stuff out here a lot better. So
yeah,
I love it. I give like Portland a lot of hell, and my wife's always getting on to me like, you need to say one nice thing for every one bad thing you say about it. I'm like, well, I'm a former news guy, so that's not really how we tick.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, there are many, many wonderful things about Portland, and the people here are way better than Seattle. Sorry, Seattle. Way friendlier, down to earth. So it sucks to see it fall like it has in the last several years. So, but I think it's turning around.
There's potential.
I hope.
Yeah. I always feel like there's potential. I was curious. This question just popped into my head, but like, was there some reason in particular, like news-wise, you got out of news, or was it just purely
got laid off one too many times?
Okay. I can definitely like attest to that, because I survived a couple rounds of layoffs in TV, and it's always scary, like when it's coming and you miss the chopping block, you see people that go, and
it's unstable. And at ICIJ, which I was at with Panama Papers, so we published the Panama Papers, and I was a contractor, so I wasn't a full employee, but the understanding had been that I was a full-time.
Yeah.
Like they would just roll over my contracts. 3 weeks afterward, they like called me up. We're out of money. So sorry. It's going to be a couple months. So I went and worked with a friend on his book that he was writing about the Panama Papers. It eventually became a movie, The Laundromat.
I'll have to check that out. I've never seen that.
Yes, Steven Soderbergh did it.
Nice.
It's worth a watch.
I like him, yeah.
But I just did some research on that and for his book, and he kind of like kept me afloat for a while. And then, I mean, the 2 months turned into like 13 months.
Just waiting.
It's just a real bad experience. But I was already like kind of falling out of love with with journalism.
One foot out the door
at that point.
Yeah.
I think the turning step, the change for me was like 2014, 15 when I really noticed like things were turning. It was like the Great Awakening and stuff. And I just thought it was like, why is the press going along with it and pushing it rather than questioning it and scrutinizing it, you know? And so I just kind of watched. I'd been a media critic before, so I watched with that lens. And I think I was a business media critic, which is kind of harder to criticize business media than the regular press. There's an old Chomsky quote where like, if he wants to know what's really happening, he reads the Wall Street Journal or the FT or what, because money is writing on it.
Yeah.
And it's true. Like, you know, at the Wall Street Journal, we were down the middle, as down the middle as you could get. Rigorous. They had the best people. I always thought the Times was a little flabby when I worked at the Journal. Like, I'd read our stuff and then read theirs, and it's like there's more opinion in it. There's more just flab. And so anyway, I mean, I think, you know, I just kind of
You saw that.
was sitting there and watching it change, and I didn't like it, and I was loud about it, you know. And I think
vocal about it.
very vocal about it. And so I think, you know, it wasn't like I was going to get a big job in journalism again after all the things I said about stuff like that. So
I see.
I kind of limited my own prospects. But it's also, you know, I took a job running a trade magazine after ICIJ for a year, which was kind of a disaster. It was not a good job for me. And then that was my like, oh yeah, I don't need to be hanging on to this industry. Like, I can get out and go. So
that makes sense. Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe at some point in the future, I'll do some stuff, but I'm not foreclosing it. But for now, it's been real nice to be in a stable,
and you can kind of
financial situation.
No feast or famine, and then you can kind of observe. And
I mean, even when I started the Journal, they paid me $36,000 a year in New York. So I mean, it was 2002, so that's probably like 50 grand or 54 or something now,
which is
but
nearly impossible to live on.
New York City,
New York, yeah.
So, and then they put freeze on wages, you know, because it was the recession. So I had, I mean, it was tough to live there, and I racked up this credit card debt, and eventually I was like, I got to stop this. I was taking on debt to do work for the Wall Street Journal in New York. Not like I was living lavishly, but done that a couple times with jobs in journalism, and you know, didn't go into it to get paid, right? To get paid well, but you have to live. So it's just unstable. And we kind of focused on my wife's career after 2007, 8, because I was like, look, I could see it all coming.
Yeah.
You know, I documented as it happened at CJR. And when we moved from the East Coast, I was like, that's where all my job prospects are. So eventually, you know, I knew like I was gonna get out at some point. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I still think like eventually, do I want to write a book or go back to dinner reporting? I don't think I'd want to be a news reporter anymore, but I like what I'm doing now, so it's all good.
Nice. Yeah. No, that totally makes sense to me. There's a couple things I was thinking, like the finance thing, that totally makes sense, because I've always been like just student of finance. One of the reasons I thought the media literacy thing could be a good idea, because a lot of people talk about financial literacy classes and how helpful they could be. I'm always just a person of like, control your own money and you can live a better life. But I'm saying that because I still read a lot of CNBC, Market Watch, but I see the same with those guys. Like, they used to be a lot more just neutral. Here's the money angle.
Yeah.
And now it's not quite the same, but I was thinking that, and also like, I guess that's kind of why I keep thinking about this class thing, is like, because I just see, and maybe it's because both of us spent time in media, I see so many outlets just take the press release from government or wherever, just basically rerun it. And no challenging it, no questioning it or anything. And I just wish people would have that lens sometimes, because I don't know. The challenge aspect seems to be dropped these days. And
you could say, I mean, it wasn't in the Trump administration, right? They figured out how to do that in the Trump administration. So
yeah,
it's not just I was about to excuse him a little bit from that, but it didn't happen for those 4 years, you know?
Yeah.
So it's like, oh, it can be done.
That's true. I actually never thought about that. Yeah.
At least on the federal level, you know, with certain things. But like, you know, it noticeably changed in 2021. So, you know, I mean, some of it is a resource thing. Like, you don't have enough resources. I don't have enough time. If I'm writing 2 or 3 or 4 stories a day or whatever, you're not going to be able to scrutinize anything.
Yeah.
But I do think, you know, I think it's a priorities and sympathies and worldviews, and, you know, it has a lot to do with it, you know. I think, yeah, I mean, my beef with the Trump coverage of the press is like, one of the big reasons Trump got elected was because of you guys. Like, for many, many reasons. Like, they created Trump, the media writ large did. He's a media phenomenon. You can't think of him in any other way. He wouldn't have been what he was 50 years before, you know. TV creature, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And but also, you know, the backlash to the press being out of touch with a wide swath of the American people, you know. And I thought for a minute after November 2016 that they were going to adjust to that. There was some introspection, and then they latched on to Russiagate.
Yeah,
went to town, and that was that. So,
and that's a hard thing to like break through, because that like was before I like shifted my own ideology, and I was totally like, for a while I was in that, and I was just like, there's something to this, we're gonna find it, and blah blah blah. And it's just, I don't know, it's a great example because it's just so much time and money put into this thing, this narrative that turned out to be like little to nothing to it. And
how do you overcome that?
Yeah,
you know, like everybody saw it, like it was the story in the country for 2 years.
Yeah,
and they pushed it and it fell apart, you know. Like, as an institution, how do you overcome that without, and there was no apologies, very few.
Yeah.
Like CJR, actually, I'm negative on CJR the last few years, but they hired Jeff Girth, an old hand from the New York Times, to do a big investigation into the press's Russiagate coverage, and he did like a four-piece thing. So I have to give credit to CJR from that, for that, because it was a great accountability moment, and there needs to be more of those. Yeah, I mean, you can't really complain about the press not believing you and calling you fake news and stuff when you go off and do something like that.
Yeah.
And there's many more things like that happen. So.
It's, yeah, well, it's such a challenge. One of the things I was going to ask you, and it's like impossible, I guess, for anyone to answer this, but like, how do you improve that lack of trust nowadays? And because I see all those graphs and data about trust in the press is an all-time low, and
yeah, I don't know. I'm not a glass half full kind of guy.
Yeah,
I'm not
either. But
I think I don't think it's going to happen. No, we're done with that. And we probably moved back to the more partisan press.
Yeah.
Of before, and that's for structural economic reasons and technological reasons. You know, in the 1800s, you had the newspapers were aligned with parties, so like explicitly aligned with like the Democrat Party.
Is that kind of what you meant? Because you said earlier, like, it was neutral, but before that it was.
Yeah.
Is that kind of what you mean?
Yeah. And there used to be, you know, like Tulsa would have 4 papers or something,
right,
like in the early 1900s, and New York had a dozen, and there was a lot more competition. over time, that as papers folded or they got bought out and they consolidated, and then you had two papers left. You had a morning paper and an afternoon paper in almost every city in the country. By when TV comes along in the 50s and 60s, you don't have a need for the PM papers anymore, because people, hey, what happened after last night?
Just turn it
and
on
you would,
TV.
yeah, and so you used to do that with the PM paper, and people would subscribe to both. So they either moved into joint operating agreements with the morning paper, or they folded or got bought out, merged, and then you had one paper left, and it was just a money factory. I mean, the advertisers had to go there, and so they turned the screws on the advertisers and raised their ad rates every year, and they minted money for 30 years. I mean, it's one of the most profitable industries in the world, you know. And then the internet comes along, 93, 94, 95, and they no longer monopolize the means of publication and stuff. And so then as that technology matured in the 2000s, that's when you had the collapse
decline,
begin.
Yeah.
So I think, and then now with social media, you know, you have, rather than having a partisan press where you had several different papers all aligned with specific parties or you know, ideologies, now you have an atomized press where everybody can be their own
Right.
press or whatever. And so it's unclear what happens with that, what that looks like 20 years from now. But I don't think we're going back to the kind of Walter Cronkite, voice of God, journalism thing anymore. I don't think because that model was, long way of saying, that model depended on having a mass readership and viewership, and that's gone.
Right.
It's not coming back. Yeah. And so what are the incentives for niche viewerships and readerships? I think it's probably going to look more like it did in the 1800s than what it did from 1950 to
that makes sense. Yeah,
95.
I didn't know that about back then. Like, so you just had all these competing papers with their own angle, and you could just pick and choose.
They'd explicitly, especially in the early 1800s, be a party paper. Like the Democratic Party would have its own paper, you know, and so. So I kind of doubt we'll go back to that explicit model, but I mean, you sort of have it implicit now anyway, right?
Yeah.
Like Fox News and National Review and Daily Caller are there for the Republican Party, and MSNBC, New York Times, NPR there for the Democratic Party. And so
that was actually one of my things on here, because this is just because we live in Portland, but I hear people all the time like, hey, like they don't view MSNBC the same way as they do Fox. And it's like, you have to understand, I don't know. It just seems to be such a lack of understanding of, like, just me saying this doesn't mean I like Fox. I'm just trying to point out that there's an angle on both, you know. And but let's quickly just go through your favorites. So what's your favorite thing in the Northwest? Could be a person, place, thing, anything. You mentioned it was beautiful, but
yeah, I mean the just being able to go out to be at the ocean an hour and a half, be at the mountain in 45 minutes or an hour, you know.
Yeah.
You can't minimize that. That's amazing. The food is great. I like to eat.
Yeah.
Maybe the best food city in the country for the price, and certainly for the size. And I like the people here. I think the people are friendly. You know, they're not like Southern friendly, but the Southern friendliness has its own drawbacks too. So, weird Portland. There's like good weird Portland, and there's bad weird Portland. There's like curdled weird, you know, and there's like healthy weird. I like the healthy weird. So I was in Hippo Hardware yesterday.
I remember that. Yeah, I know that place. Yeah.
That's like the good old weird Portland.
You can just find really weird stuff in there, and
it was amazing. So I don't know, there's a lot to that. I mean, that's why I'm still here, right? I thought about getting out in 2020, but
you're
stayed. We decided to double down. We're like expanding. We're trying to build a couple new rooms in our attic, and City of Portland's now held us up for 4.5 months. So
I was just thinking, is that I've never dealt with that myself, but I've just heard the permitting and stuff. Supposedly they're revamping a lot of that, which
Not
is
time for me.
overdue. Yeah, but
They got like, I had to pay $500 for a forestry permit. And I'm like, what is that? Now I know. It's like
forestry, is that what you
the
said?
tree guys comes out and like looks at your trees and makes sure they're okay. And I have 400, probably close to 100-foot tall trees
Wow,
on my parking strip. I just have a normal Portland size lot. And then one over here, there's one little light patch. And I planted a small cherry tree, and he's holding up our permit because of that. Because I didn't have a approved street tree every 25 feet. Like I have more tree canopy than anybody in Portland.
But it has to be a certain type of tree. Is that what...
Yeah, there's like, oh man, don't get me started on the tree regulations. The city owns the trees, but you have to pay for the trees and the upkeep in the parking strip.
So you're talking the ones on the sidewalk?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in between the sidewalk and the street.
Right.
So you can't, like, if you want to prune anything that's more than, I think, a quarter inch, you have to get a permit from the city.
Oh, man.
Which, like, look, Portland, part of its charm is all the trees. So, but it gets a little calcified, But so, we're dealing with that. And then it's just mind-numbing.
I'd imagine, yeah. It's a lot of... and we talked about a lot of this, but what's your least favorite thing, Pacific Northwest?
I do not like the groupthink kind of progressive bien pensant kind of I don't like that at all.
Yeah,
like,
just
I think that
defaulting
it just really rubs me the wrong way. And I mean, if I were in, I think it's partly a personality flaw on my part, a large part, like just I'm contrarian and churlish or whatever.
Yeah.
A curmudgeon. If I were in Oklahoma, if I were still in Tulsa, I'd be doing the same thing about the right wingers or whatever. But
I feel like that about myself sometimes. Like, I wonder if I was in a different climate, if I would just, because I'm a contrarian as well. But
I just don't like that. You have to think this or you're a bad person kind of thing. It drives me nuts.
Yeah.
And a big part of that is I grew up in a kind of fundamentalist evangelical church.
Sure, yeah.
So I reacted against that. And I, part of what drew me to journalism, I was trying to figure out what was actually real and what was not. And from a pretty early age, I was doing that with the church and stuff. And so, I think it's just, I see a lot of similarities between the groupthink there and the kind of blind allegiance that I really was repulsed by growing up.
Yeah.
So
that's a really interesting way to put it, because I've been trying to figure out, like I said, for myself too, and I always thought I'm just anti-conformist, but like, I don't know, the way you just said it makes more sense, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm
because I had the similar thing. I guess you'd be a hardcore atheist. Like, I'm still like, I don't know, I'm more of like a agnostic person now, but like, I never thought of it that way, of like, you're just challenging the status quo in the same exact way.
Yeah, I mean, it just stuff that I've been told over the years that didn't make sense. It just drives me nuts,
Yeah.
And when everybody just goes along with it, it just, I can't take it.
It makes sense. Yeah.
So there's a lot of that here, a lot of it. Yeah. It's like, I think a lot of it was unthinking, and it's just like, this is what you are. You're a good person.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
We like justice. But like, you have to think about things and their potential consequences. And so I don't know, not that I've got all the answers or any answers or whatever. It's just like, just critical that way. So
yeah,
probably a personality issue.
No, I think it's smart. I think it's healthy. Is there anything else you want to talk about or ask me or add?
I don't know. Oh, what do you think about how's it around here
In my neighborhood?
in your neighborhood? Like I'm in Selwood.
Oh, okay.
And it's so I think there's a and I've got 4 kids.
Yeah.
So like, I'm like more attuned to threats, I think, than I would be if I didn't have 4 kids.
Totally.
But Selwood's like pretty idyllic
Mm-hmm.
neighborhood on the east side, and
Yeah,
So
I like
like
Selwood.
I
Yeah.
love Selwood. I love my neighbors, and it's almost like its own little village or something.
It is, yeah.
And so I feel insulated from a lot of the stuff that I gripe about.
Yeah, yeah.
But at the same time, I live in the city and drive, my kids to soccer, and my wife works downtown and stuff like that. And
So you're seeing it all.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm just always curious how people in other neighborhoods feel about the changes and
Yeah.
what's happened since they've been here.
Yeah, let's say, because I've been here for I've been here maybe 6 years in this neighborhood, and it's got a little better maybe the past year, but it's still just, I think part of me is also just numb to it, because like I commute 5 days a week usually, and I'll go up on 205, and getting up there, you just see like everything. Like I see, I don't know, homeless fires. One day I woke up and literally woke up to like crime tape right by 92nd. And there was, I think it was a stabbing, maybe a shooting, but they had like taped off a whole section, and this was just, I don't know, 3 weeks ago or something. But I'm just very used to like waking up to something like that.
Right.
But as far as like my actual neighborhood, it's got a little better. I will say that I live really close to a middle school, and the whole, I think it's supposed to be in law now, the whole school camping ban thing.
Right.
I don't really see anything happening
They're
with
still
that.
camping by that park,
Yeah.
They're
Like that's what I'm talking about. Yeah, like because I'll walk by this park over here, and there's been the same people there for months now. And,
Yeah.
And some of them I talk to and they're friendly and stuff, but it just, I'm not taking personal beef with any of them, but it's just like there's supposed to be this school thing going on, and I don't really see it enforced. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like I'm in a spot that's like I said, I see all that stuff when I kind of get on my commute, but I'm also a little safer because I'm next to a school.
mm-hmm.
But I get a healthy mix of all of the problems. I feel like
Right.
I've also had, in the years I've been here, RVs literally right outside my house, and guys that, are on drugs and have mental problems, and are, my neighbors have kids, and they'll start hassling their kids and stuff. So yeah, that's why I'm like, I told some of my neighbors, I'm like, I feel for you. Like I don't have children, but that's like the last thing that I would want if I had kids is,
There's no insulating yourself, no matter where you are. I mean, the rich folks in Laurelhurst,
Yeah.
they've got lots of issues. In Selwood, not quite as rich, but well off
Similar
families.
Yeah.
They we had a shooting by the elementary school last week, a gang shooting in stolen cars right across the street from the school. And then, there was a stabbing a couple of days ago on Tacoma by the food cart pod.
Mm-hmm.
My wife's downtown the other day. Somebody's just jerking it on the corner,
Yeah.
toward traffic, not even away from traffic.
Yeah.
So it's like, there's no avoiding it, but,
Mm-hmm.
and like it's city living, right? You're going to
Yeah.
have it to a certain extent, but we're way past
It's hard. Yeah, it's a hard. I was literally talking about this yesterday with some people that were younger than me, and it's funny because like we were talking about the homicides, and they're like, it's just like any other city, and I was just sitting there like, not, First of all, we're not the scale of New York City, but per capita, I think we're, in a pretty bad spot.
when I moved our first full year here in 2016, there was like 16 homicides in Portland.
Right.
Last year it was like 102.
Yeah.
So you're talking like a 6 times. And 2016 was an outlier on the downside, but the average before, it's like high 20s, low 30s, and it's down. I think we're down 25% so far this year, but we're still gonna have
It's record
75, 80 murders.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's just, there's no getting around that. When the bodies are starting to stack up, you've got a real problem.
Yeah. And I think part of it too is, like I was saying, at least me, I think a lot of Portlanders just get numb to it because you see it every day, and it's hard to delineate between like, yes, cities have these problems, but are they seeing it every like hour of the day? And I don't know. You just kind of get embedded in it. And
I think when people come in from out of town, like my folks come from Oklahoma or whatever, and they're like,
right. And this is what we were talking about yesterday, because like everyone who describes Portland, who maybe visits or doesn't come here very much, I've heard it described as hell on earth and all this stuff, and it's like it's just hard because it's somewhere in between, right? Like it's
Well, it's like a war. Like if you're in a war zone, say an Iraq war and stuff. When I was a kid, I used to think, oh, you're in a war zone, like you're in your house and there's just bombs and guns going off all the time. Oh no, that's not really it. Like there's battles and it's not like everyday life doesn't go on to a certain extent.
Yeah.
And so like you could have a nice patch in Baghdad,
Right.
or whatever.
Right.
And there's a war going on a couple miles away. Right. So news focuses on the negative stuff for a reason. Like, and sometimes a lot of times to the detriment of readers and to like sense making. But I think, if you're seeing this stuff going on just because the sun's shining and you can have a really good burrito in the park a couple blocks away doesn't mean that all is well, it's so, I mean, we have thousands of people because you live okay. You want to think everything's okay. You have thousands of people who are living in like Hieronymus Bosch kind of situations and stuff. And you see them like sores on them and they're twitching and, like and they need help and they're not getting it. And we're not really doing anything about it. So, because we think it's,
humane,
uncharitable or unhumane to force them to do anything. So, yeah. It's hard to find that line between like normal amount of chaos. You don't want to live in Singapore, I don't think.
Yeah.
And what's not okay. So I think we're well past the what's not okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd agree with that. Cool, man. Is there anything else you want to talk about?
I think that's it.
All right. Thanks, dude. I loved this and thanks for coming in.
It's fun.